Hello, and welcome back to Dev Game Club, a weekly podcast in which two veteran game developers look at games from the past to discuss their relevance and impact today. I'm Brett Duville, and I'm joined as always by my co-host, a man who always forgets if it's red, red, green or red, green, red.
Tim Longo. Awesome. The fun thing about doing an extended Republic Commando series, like the most extended we've done, is you have to think of an intro way more than you usually do. Like,
believe me, I've been like, I have to try to think of something kind of iconic that I heard a bunch or at least is memorable. And now I'm starting to stretch into individual one-off comments that the squad members make. So here we are.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. That one's memorable to me, at least, maybe because we just played it, but and I don't know if our guests remember that, but I
remembered it from the time. So
good old Scorch.
Anyway, speaking of guests, why don't you introduce one of our two? We're actually four veteran game developers today, so why don't you go ahead and introduce our first guest, and I'll do the other one.
Yes, I'm delighted to introduce Paul Pierce to the podcast. UI artist and UX artist extraordinaire. Paul Pierce has been in the industry for 23 years, as far as I can tell. He can correct me later. And spent his first 13 years at LucasArts working on games such as Jedi Starfighter, Bounty Hunter, Galactic Battleground series, Escape from Monkey Island, Lucidity, which was a great little game, and much more there. But then he went and did the impossible, which almost none of us are able to do for as long as he's been able to do it. He left corporate life and went freelance and has been doing so ever since, almost 10 years, which is a feat in and of itself. And he has worked on more games than I can actually list here, so I won't, but he's been doing freelance UI and UX design work for games for companies like Disney, 2K, or he's worked on stuff for Disney, 2K, Transformers license, and many more things. And then most recently, he's actually worked on a project that made some, I think, really important news. First ever, I believe, game or interactive product that was approved by the FDA called Endeavor RX, which is designed to help treat kids with ADHD for a company called Achille. And so Paul has many of his own personal projects, but he's such a humble guy that he won't want to talk about any of this today, but we were going to force him to. So it to the show, Paul.
Hey, guys. Good to be here. Glad to join you today.
And take it on Greg.
Yeah. Our second guest today joined LucasArts the same time as I did, literally on the same day. And for years did concept art there, starting with Indiana Jones and the Infernal Machine, but also for a number of Star Wars titles, including Galactic Battlegrounds and the Phantom Menace game. He would go on to be our concept artist for Republic Commando, and he contributed so much to the look of that game, which is something I'm sure we'll talk a lot about. He would go on later to his current position as a senior art director for Star Wars with EA, working on their Star Wars titles, both of the Battlefront games, and most recently, Jedi Fallen Order. Welcome to the podcast, Greg Knight.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for having me.
Hello.
Yeah, so one of the things, as I warned you guys about, that we definitely like to start with, and in fact, unless my memory, as you guys know, is bad anyway, and that seems like a joke that comes up every episode that I seem to bring up. I don't know if I know much about you guys pre-industry, so I'd love to hear about sort of like where you guys came from and how you got into things. And so the listeners definitely want to know. We have a lot of listeners who are interested in getting into the industry, and even though we're all old timers and it's not like it used to be, it's still kind of interesting to people to hear sort of your journey to where you essentially eventually got to LucasArts. So, Paul, why don't we maybe start with you on sort of where you went to school or how you got into things, et cetera, et cetera.
Sure. So I went to school. I got my degree from NYU. I went to film school there. And of course, after doing all that, I then decided that I did not want to do film as a career, which a lot of people seem to do sometimes.
Right.
And so I left there, and I did some video sort of production stuff for a while. But then when I moved to California, my first real job in California was actually at Whole Foods Market. They were hiring a sign maker.
Oh, that's right. I remember this.
In store. And they were opening the Mill Valley store, the first Northern California store they were opening. And so I did.
Of course, it would be Mill Valley.
Of course, right? Yes. And so I did, I was a sign maker in that store, so I would make signs and do computer stuff. And it was sort of at that point where I bought my first Mac and sort of taught myself Photoshop and Illustrator and all that stuff. And then, so I was at Whole Foods for a few years. Then I jumped, it was sort of the mid 90s when web design, everything was sort of blowing up on the web. So I worked for a company that a friend of mine, I happened to run into him years later, a guy I went to high school with, had started a company awesomely called Cybernautics, which was a web design company in Sausalito.
Nice.
So we did a bunch of web stuff for them. And one of the things I remember from that, we did a website for a company called Rocket Science Games, which was an early company. I think they had this game called Obsidian or something. Oh. And we had to make a website for them that before the game even came out. So we had to be creative and come up with some kind of an interesting website that sort of showcased what was coming. And what was coming was short-lived. I think they went out of business at some point, not too long after that. But yeah, the web design came after that. And then that led up to, I saw an ad on, I believe it was Craigslist, in sort of the mid to late 90s, looking for a graphic artist at LucasArts. And my training was not 3D, was not games. And but I thought I'd apply anyway. And I applied with like some stuff that I had drawn, just some text and images and stuff. And it turns out that they were looking for a graphic artist to do a bunch of graphics for a CD-ROM project, Behind the Magic, which was like a Star Wars encyclopedia.
Oh, yes.
That's why I was hired.
Yeah, right.
Did a bunch of graphics for that. And then there were a lot of the graphics in that were UI related. And so that just sort of dovetailed into, hey, next project's coming up. We need a UI artist. And that's where I found my niche right after that. So.
And that was also Hayden. Wasn't that Hayden's first thing?
It was. And now I'm remembering that because that's how we ended up playing StarCraft together all the time.
Exactly. Yeah, I was hired. Hayden and I were hired within the week of each other. I think he was hired first, and then I was hired a week later.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah. Probably listeners know Hayden Blackman. Yes, that's who we're talking about. Yes, right. And then on Monkey Island, on Escape from Monkey Island, you actually did some 3D work. Is that right?
I did. I did a bunch of 3D. I modeled and textured and lit 4 of the interior and exterior environments for that, with the amazing help of Dan Colon teaching me Lightwave. Right. So that was a fun little project and team to be on, just like learning and being able to jump in and contribute to that. So
cool.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah. How about you, Greg? How'd you get in? I mean, I know you came from Petaluma.
Yeah,
but
still there now too.
I was going to say you were. I seem to remember you're like 4th generation, 5th generation Petaluma, or something like that, or more than that, maybe.
My kids are 8th, actually.
Oh my goodness! Yeah. I knew it was a lot. Yeah.
I did not know that. Holy.
Yeah.
It's a whole lot of.
You probably did know that, Tim, but I remember these things. And...
Greg probably told me that many times.
Yeah.
Anyway, how'd you get in?
One of the benefits of being in this area is kind of Lucasfilm is just, down the road. And I think that, what that does is brings a lot of people and energy into the area that where the entertainment industry is kind of on around and available. However, growing up, I wasn't sure exactly what I wanted to do. And I knew I wanted to go into art. So I was mostly looking at trying to get strong at the fundamentals. But just like probably you guys as well, there wasn't a straight path to working in the industry or working in games. So when I was looking at art schools, I could have maybe gone into illustration, but illustration was very different at the time. They weren't targeted towards entertainment design. So instead I found the classes that I wanted in a fine arts curriculum. So you could get your anatomy, composition, color theory training while learning to paint. But then in the end, I graduated as an abstract painter, and realized.
Are you serious?
Yeah, you find a different path as you go. And then when I graduated, I thought, well, actually, I don't know if I really want to be a gallery artist. I think I have more interested in either comics or games. So kind of after school, I was spending my time putting together a portfolio. I was both putting together a portfolio for comic books, one of my loves, and video games. But then kind of one of the jobs that you get during those times, I started working for a local collectibles company. And it ended up, it was just, I was a production assistant, I guess you would say, where I was just helping out with the work that you had to do with the project. But one of the great things I got to do was we had these signed lithographs by Ralph McQuarrie. So I worked it out where I was the person driving to Ralph's house with hundreds of these lithographs.
That's right.
And he and I would sit in his studio, and I would line up his lithographs, and he would sign one at a time. And I would do that every Friday for hours. And he and I would be talking about art, his own personal history. He would let me flip through his sketchbooks. Ralph and I would go sit and have lunch together. It was an amazing experience.
Getting chills.
It kind of shaped my interests and direction afterwards. So when an opportunity came up at LucasArts, I applied, and Ralph was very kind enough to lie and give me a letter of recommendation. So I know when I came in and started with the same team I was on with you, Tim, was Indiana Jones and the Infernal Machine. I remember Hal giving me a raised eyebrow when he saw my letter of recommendation. So it was a pretty awesome experience, though. And that's how I started up at LucasArts, and then obviously worked through there, moving into Star Wars projects where I got to work with Chris Williams on Galactic Battlegrounds, and then Chris was one of those guys where when you're figuring out the next project you work on, you're going, "Hey, Chris, what are you doing next? Because I want to do that too."
Yeah, right.
And thankfully, he was working with you on Republic Commando, so that's where I had the opportunity to join you guys.
Right.
On that
yeah,
project.
we've actually mentioned Chris a couple times, and I think to clarify for folks, Chris actually was an art director before he kind of moved into essentially like an EP sort of production lead producer role on RC, and so he did a bunch of different things, and he's an executive at this point. But yeah, he had an interesting path as well. So for people who are so on Galactic Battlegrounds, I believe, right? Was he the art director or lead artist?
Yeah, he was, and I really learned a lot working with him. So kind of as he was moving out of the art director role with RC, there were so many people that understood the aesthetic,
right,
that he trusted numerous people within the team to kind of see it through. And being in concept art with it, I was able to kind of help out with some of the visual elements on the game.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, so just to give people a sense of, the mark that the two of you have left on the game, basically everything on the screen has kind of gone through your hands in one sense. Certainly all of the HUD art is all Paul. Mm-hmm. And then how everything else was designed to look went through Greg. So literally everything you're seeing on screen has had their fingers on it to some degree. I just want to set that up for folks just to get a sense of just how much of an impact moment to moment, literally, the two of you have had on the game, because it's huge. It's a huge deal, and I think that's a thing that probably hasn't come through yet. In our discussion, we say things like, "Well, UI and UX and concept art," and then you just to give a sense of like, "Oh no," but that just means that literally anything that you see, these two had something to do with. So
yeah, good point. Yeah. I think the next space that we like to kind of hit is around sort of, especially with the two of you, because we actually haven't had too many artists, like pure artists, on the podcast, and I think we don't kind of go too deeply into the job that often. So I think it's a good opportunity for each of you to kind of talk about, okay, now you're at LucasArts and you're working on some of these early projects. What is, not necessarily yet about the projects themselves, and we'll get to RC, shortly, but kind of what is the job? Like what is your role? What do you do? We don't have to do like a day in the life of or day-to-day kind of stuff, but what is it? Kind of explain to people, especially because the two of you have fairly different, from an artistic standpoint, fairly different jobs, at least at this era. So Paul, maybe we can start with you. Now you've gotten off of the sorry, there was June. My dog makes an appearance on the podcast, so we just kind of embrace it. You're now moving into game-centric stuff off of Behind the Magic. Is that what it was called?
Right.
Yeah. And so what is that job like? Like what is the process, and how did it work for you at LucasArts?
Yeah, so it was, the Behind the Magic was a specific thing, and it was more just, graphic design and Photoshop work, that kind of thing. And then sort of going into, the next projects after that were more games proper. And so the need there was for more UI, UX design. And so, the process, it's pretty straightforward. Games have menus to sort of get the player into, the game proper. And, it's everything from turning on the game and splash screens and menus and all that kind of stuff. And then once you're in the game, it's all the HUD stuff. So it's basically just, there's some design docs up front, sort of outlining, what menus are needed and what the flow is going to be like. And then for the HUD, it's like, what's the most important information to, give the player at any time. So I think part of it is art, part of it is making that stuff look great. But part of it always was UX and figuring out, what's the best way to make it clear to the player, how to do what they want to do, how to get in there and get the player doing what they need to do, if that makes sense.
Yeah. We actually, I think, very clumsily talk about UI and UX separately on the podcast. At least I try to, as much as I can. I don't think I do a great job at talking about the subjects because I'm not an expert like you are, but I'm glad you brought up, that UX is a different sort of aspect of our work, and it's, and there's sort of expertise in both, and
right.
And there's actually a third axis that I'd like to bring up in your case too, and there's UI and UX, and I think that's something that I've loved working with Paul in the past on, because he brings both of those, but also there's implementation as well, that you weren't afraid to kind of get your hands dirty, and get in there. And especially in RC's case, you were in Unreal, right? You were in the engine implementing. Am I remembering that right?
No. Yeah, I may have done a little bit of that, but that process was, to me, my recollection is that process was very old school, which is that, I do mock-ups in Illustrator, and then I break out assets and give them to, a UI programmer to implement. And so I may have done a little bit of that, but it was very, my role was very art and design and UX centric. Implementation was mostly programmers.
Tech art. And
yeah, right.
Yeah. Okay. Well, there's my memory in action right there, right off the bat. So yeah, good for me for not remembering any of that. But yeah, on the UI and UX side of things, that's definitely, to be honest, like teams are so big these days, and specialists, and people end up specializing in specific things. And the kinds of teams that some of us have worked on, recently, you have a UI person and a UX person, and they can be different people sometimes,
Right.
and so there's just so much to do. So,
right.
And, freelancing, I assume that you would have to kind of be a jack of all trades to some degree and
Right.
kind of work on many things.
I mean, I will say, though, that one of the things I really appreciated about Paul at the time was that he was, with the UI, he had the ownership to really be pushing on the UI programmer. I don't honestly remember who that was, but it certainly wasn't me. But definitely there's tons of sort of little touches, like the little tick marks that'll indicate the direction each of the squad members, or their kind of overall state, in the sort of left side of the HUD or whatever. All these definite little touches that were not just there. It's not like you just give us, here, just do this and hook these things up. There's constantly iteration as well. So it's very much a contributing process, and that might be also part of that experience aspect as well, is like, you're going to need to know where your squad members are relative to you. How can we communicate that in the UI in a clean, clear way?
Right. Yeah, I would agree with that. It's like, because you have people looking at the game, every minute of every day for such a long period of time, and all the people come from different disciplines, so they're experiencing different things, seeing different things, and bringing up their ideas. And so it was absolutely an iterative process to build it. And if this wasn't working, you try something else. If something needs to be shown that it's not shown, mock it up, give it a try. And that's So you're right. It does sort of appear effortless when you look at it, but there's a lot of process behind getting it to that point. Yeah.
How about you, Greg? What's can you kind of go through? And I think in your case, because you started out as texture artist as well, so maybe even hit a little bit of that early.
Yeah, I think with any of our careers in the jobs, there's a lot of shifting and evolving into the different roles that you do. And I think even when we started, there wasn't I started as a concept artist, as a text artist. So when you kind of, you're not working off a pre-designed area of what the mood and feeling of a thing is. So when you're going in to paint the backgrounds and to understand the kind of setting of the space, if it's a room, you could do wood slats for the textures, but if you really wanted to get into understanding what the feeling that you wanted the player to feel in those locations, you started to kind of imagine the whole thing as a whole. And what I would do is have these little sketches off to the side where if I was handed over a room to texture, I would do little sketches to try and imagine the whole thing as a whole. And it was at that time when my art director dropped by and said, whoa, we actually have more of a need for that than we do the textures right now. So it was an era where, especially at LucasArts, you maybe had Peter Chan come in and do maybe 20, 30 concept drawings of the spaces, the important iconic areas you would go to. But it wasn't traditionally something that you had someone do full time at games. So quickly I moved from doing the texture art and background paintings to concept art, imagining what rooms looked like and what the visual design between these areas were, mostly focusing on environments. And that was a pretty great opportunity to get to learn how to design while working on these projects. Obviously, with Lucasfilm as partner, we had access to amazing examples of designers like Joe Johnston, Ralph McQuarrie, Doug Chang, and all of the incoming prequel artists that we were getting to see at the time. So it was kind of an exciting time to be learning how to do these things and then pull it together into our own products, our own games. So I think after Infernal Machine, we did a little bit on the game Obi-Wan that was mentioned in an earlier podcast, and then we Galactic Battlegrounds, and then Republic Commando.
Yeah, there was a small thing you mentioned there that I want to pull on a little bit, and really just for a moment. And because we talk about it in the context of a lot of other roles in this era of game development, because it was kind of a transition especially for LucasArts, but I think for the industry, and the concept, no pun intended, of having a concept artist permanently attached to a team or even a couple teams, and that's kind of all they did, kind of on staff. I forgot until you said that was a pretty rare thing at the time. That wasn't common. And I probably am misremembering, as I've already proven in this podcast episode, but do I remember there sort of being some battles about the need for that sometimes too, where we would have to actually like really, it was eventually proven that it was a necessity, but by the Bill Tillers of the world and stuff like that. But it wasn't a common thing, like you said, and it was a bit of a, I don't want to say like a minor culture change. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think once you got a little bit more fidelity that you could build out in something, it needed to be more than just a cube. And and you found that depending on the skills of the modeler, for example, if it was just a modeling workflow, if the modeler had the kind of conceptual skills to be able to build something based off of a vision they had in their mind, they could move pretty quickly. But that wasn't always the case with your entire staff. So some people would benefit by having a drawing in front of them to work from. And then you knew that they could build an asset within a day, where if they weren't working off a drawing, they required more time. So I think it was highly questioned, but it ended up being pretty easy to prove out that it was time saving. Yeah. It probably had to do with the size of the games and the additional detail that we were able to build into, and also the amount of content that was required of games. The playtime of some of these games equals the amount of space that you cover. So, easily a 5-6 hour game requires a ton of content and ideas coming through. And an artistically driven game has all of those kind of experiences threaded together in their own visual style. So and cohesive flow. So you feel like it's a part of one art direction, but also escalating in and having kind of this visual through line that progresses as you move.
Right. Yeah, I think you nailed one of the key, the fidelity going up, team size, fidelity, different roles. I mean, this was also a transition for level designers, as we've talked about too, where, in the Jedi Knight and Dark Forces days, the concept of a world modeler was just generally the level designer. They were the ones, and I, in fact, vividly remember working with you on texture art on Indiana Jones in one of the Egyptian tombs, where we were, working hand in hand. But I was basically the modeler, which is ridiculous to say, of those kind of spaces. And we were trying to match the textures to the geometry and blah, blah, blah. But that, as that starts to shift and fidelity goes up and you get level artists or, environment artists becoming a more common thing, then you need that support for them, which I guess would, seem that you've worked in film as well, like that kind of ended up sort of mirroring the film industry to some degree, right? As far as concept art leading the way. Yeah,
I think there's a good experience with that because there's some big differences. Film starts with the script, and in a lot of cases you can take that script and then break it down to exactly what you need and design. And then you can kind of, it's all unknown very early on. And in game development, it's a lot more dynamic, and finding the fun, and it would be different if you could start off with that. Some games do have the ability to start off with that script and kind of see it through to the end without much change. I've seen that more in some of the adventure game type things I've been on, but these more immersive experiences where the player can look in any direction. It really does mean that there's a lot of content and room for ideas and supporting visuals to come in. There's a quick thing I'll touch on about the difference in gaming films in that regard that I think is important to note is in a video or in a movie, it's conceivable that a movie director has a visual idea of what the entire experience is going to be for that, let's say, 2-hour experience. It is possible for one person to hold that visual together because it's such a tight experience. Once you talk about a video game that has, maybe at the very minimum, a 6-hour experience, the game is just looking for ideas to make that experience entertaining from beginning to end, and opportunities to make it a stronger experience. So those ideas in a game can come from most anyone. So one of the compelling things about being working on a game is that the good ideas come from all over. And RC was one of those examples of that, where even though in concept art, a lot of you're kind of visualizing a lot of those ideas, but we were visualizing ideas coming from the entire team. I love to say that I was getting some of my better thoughts from talking to Nathan Martz in AI, or sitting next to Jeremy. The whole team was contributing ideas, and ideas that you can see and play in the game. And I think that was a pretty that's a pretty unique, fun, awesome thing about games. That you don't see in other medias.
Right. Yep. No, fair enough. And I think a lot of there's a lot of good evidence in good games having that be sort of in the culture of the team. Often is what breeds, I think, good quality as well. You can definitely have the auteur kind of products as well, the Kojimas or what have you too, and those can be successful in different ways. But yeah, totally agree. And it's so yeah. I mean, I guess that kind of brings us to maybe we can start talking directly about Republic Commando and your guys' experiences on that, and maybe back over to Paul. I think one of the things that we touched on in the series so far when it comes to the HUD, I mean, obviously one of our visions for the game was first person all the time, right? And exclusively. And so that does put a big burden on the HUD, right? And on the helmet, and developing that, making it feel good, and not even just from a UX perspective, but just from an aesthetics perspective as well. Do you recall, and maybe you and Greg and I can batter back and forth because we probably all have some small memories, but when it comes to our influences and what we were trying to do with that, I would say pretty unique and cool and well executed HUD. I mentioned, I think earlier in the series, I mentioned, Metroid Prime was something we looked at. And then of course the prequels specifically were something that I think I know that you can probably speak to it, but especially the design work, the line work, and sort of the aesthetics of it, where I think we're heavily coming from the prequels, of course. So, do you recall any of those?
Yeah, I remember. Obviously, Metroid Prime was predated by a couple of years, but that was definitely an influence. And I don't remember, we could have early on, maybe, because Metroid Prime, you don't really have the sense of a helmet. It's all UI elements just sort of floating. And we may have explored options where it was just UI elements. But I think it was, pretty strong. People had pretty strong feelings about, integrating those UI elements into the helmet. So you see, maybe it's a little unrealistic. You wouldn't actually see inside your helmet if you were wearing it. But just the idea of the commandos, the very distinctive sort of T shape, integrating the UI into that so that you see a little bit of the head padding. You see like what would be, microphones that would, allow them to speak to each other. And so maybe it's not 100% realistic, but it just adds a lot of flavor. It makes the UI very distinctive, definitely at the time. And
I remember that. I remember that being a bit of a conversation for sure, because you're immediately giving up some screen real estate, to do that, and that's screen real estate is precious, especially when you're 640 480 probably on the Xbox. I don't remember if it was that or a little higher, but around that. Maybe 720. I don't think so. It's pretty low res. Right. So you're giving up a lot, to take away some of that.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Paul, I don't know if you remember, but I have vague memories of those battles for sure. Not even just with Brett, probably, but it was. Coming from the Jedi Knights, and like some of our shooter legacy at LucasArts, pretty clean, pretty open. But I just seem to recall us really fighting hard for that immersion,
right,
if you will. And like you said, the helmet maybe wasn't realistic, but the smoke and mirrors of making it feel, because we're obviously simulating, the concept on a screen anyway, so it's pretty hard to make it be super accurate, but. But even down to the detail that you had with like the shields and the health kind of mirroring, or not mirroring, but following the lines of the helmet, the T shape like you mentioned.
Yep.
There's a nice touch where it feels integrated,
yep.
And everything really sat well amongst that. But that helmet definitely was a tricky one.
Right. I know a lot of our art decisions were always kind of coming out of the design pillars, and I know immersion must have had a huge role in all the decisions that were coming out of UI. So I know we had done a lot of work in design to try and get the ammo readout, for example, on the weapons and out of the HUD. And it was just one of those things that was really important for your design of the game, to have it be as diegetic and in the world as possible.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
It was a big challenge, but it was one of those initial goals that we all had to try to work.
Sure.
And it was all in Paul's lap, the diegetic UI, trying to get all that out off the screen and somehow motivated by either the helmet or the weapons.
Right. Yeah, I remember being given renders of different weapons, and there was probably an initial idea on a lot of the weapons about what needs to be shown and where it would be, but that was definitely an iterative process. So they would do a render of the weapon for me, and then I would Photoshop on top of it. What if the ammo count is here, and the in terms of numbers or ticks on the meter. So we would just sort of go back and forth, and they would adjust sometimes, the surfaces or the little displays that would be on the weapon to sort of accommodate those things better. So definitely a back and forth to find the best combination of, readability, but keeping it, as small as possible, but still readable.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, because I don't think we could overstate enough how complicated that stuff really is, because a weapon, as you can probably imagine, and we maybe have even said this on the podcast in various series that we've done shooters, the weapon is a lot of times the character in a shooter. And so the complication of we had the squad as a whole other element, but taking that aside for a second, the weapon itself takes on such a burden of a lot of not just information, but just the experience of it, right? The aesthetics of it, the visceral nature, et cetera, But then you throw in our crazy idea of having everything, like Greg said, diegetically imposed upon the weapon. And, it comes out, and as a player, you're looking at it like, yeah, of course the ammo reads that way. Of course the number's there, like it all makes sense. That's not, you don't get that the first time. That's not something that...
Well, no, and there's the interaction there too with the helmet, because you also like what parts of the gun are going to actually be visible. And I can remember Jeremy Talbot in particular setting up, to animate the guns and things like that. He would set up a view in whatever, Maya or Max, I don't remember which one it was for this project. I think it was Maya. With the overlay in the camera of like, so he would know like, I'll be able to see this or I won't. So he would actually, whatever animator they did a lot of sort of technical work to make it easy to see as they were building, these interactions, what it would actually, how it would read, so that they would know this important information is going to be visible, if we go zoom or, whatever, the different things we might do with a weapon and the various animations they had. So it was a whole complicated thing.
Do you, Paul, have any, things that you recall being such a pain in the butt? And I'm bringing this up in context of the weapon goal that we had that Greg mentioned, but were there things, now you're such a nice guy that you would never have told me probably, and I'm giving you the platform today to tell me or anybody, but or Jeremy, like, were there things where you look back and you're like, man, that was not easy, or not, we shouldn't have done that or whatever. And if you don't have any, that's fine. But I was just interested if there were,
right,
because this stuff is hard.
Yeah. I mean, what comes to mind is, it was such a team effort and so collaborative, and 99% of the time, everybody was in it to, make the best game possible and put egos aside and just sort of do what was best for the game. And I remember a great, my job, I mock up things, but then it actually has to be implemented. And so, working hand in hand with a programmer to get that to happen. And most of the time, it's just awesome because it's like, you explain, I get my marching orders to mock stuff up and this is how it's going to work. And then it gets handed over to a programmer to actually implement. And 99% of the time, it's like, they're just on board and we'll try anything and we'll make it work and whatever it takes. Sometimes there's a little resistance because, it's like, we want it to work like this. And, a little bit of resistance in terms of, I'm not sure if we can do that kind of, thing.
Yeah.
And, it's like, you can try and we'll see where it ends up. But, that was the only, the only challenges that I remember is like, the idea comes to me, I mock it up and, it's not just I'm making stuff up out of thin air. It's like, all you guys have talked about it beforehand. And so when I get something to mock up, there's a lot of weight behind, everybody's sort of on board about how this is going to work. And so, but then it has to be implemented. And so, most of the time everybody was on board, but sometimes there's a little pushback and, it might take a little extra work, or I'm not sure we can do this. And,
I remember something like the ammo on the little ammo ticks actually corresponding to how many, shots you had left in a clip on like the DC-130, the main machine pistol, being a thing, or machine gun, I should say, being a thing that was like, I don't know if we can really make that the same, actually correspond to the. I remember that conversation.
I remember
things
that.
like that. Yeah, just like, okay, and it's. I will say, as a programmer, you get us at the right time and we'll do just about anything. You get us at the wrong time, and we have so many. Our work is so opaque to so many people. Like, it's just people don't understand what we do or how we do it or whatever. It seems really alien, and so we just can blow smoke. It was just to put it, frankly. Oh, geez, that's really, really hard. And it's like, well, I was thinking about trying to get out early today. Whatever.
We're on record now, folks. We got it. Perfect track.
Not me. I would never do that.
I remember that conversation. I was thinking, I thought it would be fine if the player knew they had a lot or a little.
Right.
But I think the designers were like, no, I want to know if I have two ammo counts left.
As I recall, I think the issue was really like, well, what if we change the clip size? That it's, that there's like, well, what if for balancing reasons, we want to make it, I don't know, 50 or 30 or whatever. I have no idea what the actual number is, but, that was kind of the, minor roadblock sort of thing thrown up of like, well, there's, just so you know, like we can do this, but there's, it's a pain in the butt to change because it requires a number of people. Like we got to fix the texture. We got to do this. We got to do the other thing, and how do we work around that?
And that's actually there's a good conversation to have there about that, right? Because iteration is so important and you need to be able to be flexible and data driven as much as possible. And so that's the architecture of that seems like a good argument to have. Then it just, prove the point of making sure that you can still do both, change it and
you just need to need to understand the cost of changes that you're going to have to make, and so you try to make a really good first stab if it's going to involve multiple people and things like that to make a change. For sure. But I can definitely remember conversations like those.
So, Greg, what about so you're coming from Galactic Battlegrounds and kind of coming over with Chris on Galactic Battlegrounds, and I have these memories of you on that project because like the concept art output of that game was, in my memory, astounding because it was an RTS and every unit, you literally had to draw and paint every unit basically, right, for people because it ended up having to be a render, right? So you were coming off of loads of work. Is that my memory right on that?
Yeah, it was a big experience.
It had to fit into a 256 color palette besides, as I recall.
I know. By the end of the project, I was shifting colors on pixels just to get it when they were downscaling them, getting it to look right.
Right.
But yeah, that was a pretty awesome experience because it made you design quickly on the fly. So it was a trial by fire, and me and a handful of, I think we had two other concept artists. We were just doing all these designs for civilizations and their vehicles that didn't exist. So it was a fun experience. But a lot of it was delivering what the player expected to see from the films whenever possible. So it meant a deep dive into trying to deliver authentic Star Wars, but in this RTS format. And so in a lot of cases, you were making original designs or modifying existing designs, kind of fit the gameplay need within reason so that it didn't butcher people's iconic vehicles.
Right.
But coming into Republic Commando was a neat experience because we were looking at your design pillars, or the way the initial game was kind of evolving. The more we talked about this clone experience that you and Darren were kind of fleshing out, and the more we were doing more artwork about clones in different situations, we could see we were going for this kind of more immersive, dangerous clone story. Mm-hmm. And I think terms, if I'm remembering right, you guys might remember better, but I remember terms coming out like tactical and serious and mature in the way of just a serious tone to the game. Right. Yeah. And
not rating. Yeah.
Yeah. And when you're an artist, you're looking for these design footholds to kind of start planning your visuals around and trying to figure out what tools you have available. So I think one amazing task in the very beginning was even just trying to figure out if we needed to have a special unit, if they had additional parts. So there's a few, a lot of concept art that you can find of the early days where we were just looking at what an existing suit with additional equipment on it may look like versus a more specialized design. And as the idea of the squad was coming together, those designs were being built out. But also we were kind of trying to imagine the visual style of the game. And I think figuring out what tools we wanted to use to reference or put that visual together. I think that's where there was a neat opportunity, because not only were you designing the new equipment, the new tool, the new weapons, the vehicles, and trying kind of the camera left moments of Geonosis when we were just looking at that space is like, what is the situation if the squad is going in if they're doing a maneuver, or let's say the Jedi rescue in the arena is the main action, that the squad may be doing a maneuver that's off to the side on the periphery of it with their own objectives. So there was a real opportunity for imagining beyond the film.
Yeah. Right. Yep. Yeah. Go ahead.
No. Go ahead.
Well, I was gonna. There's one of the topics you kind of threw in there that I wanted to again pull on is I guess you said kind of looking for the visual sort of like framework and what kind of style that we were going to be. And we briefly touched on it in the series, but you and Chris did end up heading toward, I don't know if exaggerated style is the right way to put it. You can probably use better words than I can, but we did make a conscious choice to morph the films to a certain percentage. We weren't trying to go for photorealistic film version of the game. We were kind of doing a little of our own thing. Can you dig into that a little bit and kind of talk about, do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, no, definitely. It's something I think a lot about because, so we knew that we had this new perspective that we were seeing the game through. And obviously when you're playing a Jedi game or you're watching the episodic films, the Jedi, like you call it, the melodrama of the episodic films give you a different one perspective through these through that universe. But when we're a clone, and a Geonosian doesn't mean anything to a Jedi. They're really just there for the plot point of slowing them down. But to a trooper, a Geonosian could mean real tragedy.
Yeah,
for
evisceration, for example.
Be death. And so is there a tool visually that we can pull on that helps reinforce that idea that these things are scarier and meaner? And I think universally we were looking for what tools we had available to make that clear. So, at the time we were seeing a lot more films with color grading, for example, really rich use of post effects. Like, I don't know if you remember, but we had a team copy of Band of Brothers, for example, where, some of these great visuals and the feeling of these stories of what it felt to be Saving Private Ryan, was another example where just being this small group, you felt in danger. And all of those references turned into tools that you can kind of pull on for our projects. So even looking at Black Hawk Down and the color grading that they were doing on there really helps sell the idea of isolation and being trapped. And so we were looking at finding any ways, to any degree of exaggeration of what could be our tool for giving the player that feeling of being a clone, but also being thrown in this extreme situation. And I think that's, we were looking at ways we could, you had mentioned in an earlier podcast that there was that trailer put together, which was Squad going back into the Geonosis. And that was very much the mood and tone of the game we were going for. It was this methodic dive into enemy territory where you were grossly outnumbered and in danger. And even in that trailer, at a questionable end, looking at references like any of the like movies like Alien or Aliens,
spookier, bad things can happen, kind of, which again, from the Jedi's perspective, don't really, there isn't that concept of, and I feel like even from a correct me if I'm wrong, but from a color tone perspective, like the movies are very vivid and vibrant. And not that the game isn't, but I feel like, it's sort of more muted and focused. Did we actually end up doing color grading over the screen, or was it more just in the design work of the? Because I don't know.
We didn't do it at runtime. No.
Yeah,
there wasn't the power at the time to do something like that. It wasn't far off, but it wasn't there.
But you're just talking in the sort of in the overall production design work.
I think I mean it as an example that at least film directors were using a lot of tools to evoke emotion. And we were looking at those same kind of tools and figuring out what do we have on hand to be able to give people this different interpretation of Star Wars. And I think what's been interesting in the last few years, because we saw Rogue One come out, and what's interesting about there is they have more of a muted palette. So much, I just felt like it just felt at home a little bit for me, because even Cassian and Jin's weapons are modifiable, just like the DC-17 was. But that is the soldier's perspective. It's like they had the same challenge in that they're telling a Star Wars story through the eyes of a soldier. And for that soldier, the people around you are important. Your equipment is important. And just like them, you've already said it, that one of our goals in the very beginning was to not show Jedi in this. But I think I almost think that if you have there's this challenge with having the soldier story stand strong on its own, and not having a Jedi run past in front of you and go, and having a few people go, "Hey, where's that guy going?"
Yeah, right.
So, there's such a strength in seeing the Star Wars universe through that perspective that it resonates with people because it's very relatable. But it's also it's a very new and fresh way to see a familiar license. So it was a neat exploration.
Yeah, I mean, in particular, and we should probably start winding down, but the The thing I was thinking of as you were talking about that stuff is that with a lot of the enemy characters, they're very hot, especially the Geonosians, right? With all that orange and then they're actually like, I don't know, clickety bits are all, sort of muted and brown. So you kind of have this high contrast in their look. And the same thing with a lot of the, I guess we call them clankers. You've got these red hot spots and things like that they're indicating sort of dangerous points on them. I don't know, that alienness contrasts really nicely, to bring it back to the UI with the very cool hues of the UI. There's almost like a, hey, this is comforting. This is what's in your face all the time as a commando. That sort of lighter blue, which I know is kind of somewhat pulled from the films, although I think that's a little more saturated and this was much paler. Anyway, I don't know. Those are some things that I kind of thought of just in there. It's just like, because I know how much Chris cared about color design and things like that for it.
Yeah. And I mean, with the, Paul, do you remember, and again, yeah, we want to be sensitive to your guys' time so we can wind down, but maybe, one final question for each of you or something like that, and then maybe hit if you have any takeaways from your experience on RC. But from the films, as Brett was saying, like what were some of the, because as Greg was saying, we were kind of intentionally going in a different direction visually from everything else. Did that impact the UI design at all? And I don't recall how that did. Like even the LucasArts intro is one of my favorites, and yes, I'm biased, but even in that, I don't remember how you were involved with that or if you were, but the sort of aesthetics of the I don't want to say low tech, but like these are the grunts, these aren't the people, the Jedi with all of the extra gravitas or something. And so was there any of that influence on the HUD itself?
Yeah, I don't remember a lot of specifics in that regard, but I mean, the marching orders have always been, you sort of are aware of what the movies have done, and, what other games have done in terms of the design and the UI. And so that's always a starting point, I think, to sort of be true to the source. And then, but I do feel like we were given, more freedom to sort of explore and sort of evolve the UI into something unique that sort of still lived in the Star Wars universe, but maybe sort of, here and there just sort of expanded things.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cause it felt like to me, it felt like it still felt Star Wars and it still felt like you said, it fit in, mm-hmm. but it wasn't something that you've kind of ever seen mm-hmm. in the films either. You know what I mean? Because right. you never really get to see inside a Stormtrooper's helmet, at least at the time.
Right.
And so, yeah. So I think that there was an opportunity for us there and for you to at least explore that space, which I think is why it resonated with people. I think we talked about the intro of the game in one of the episodes mm-hmm. and sort of like some of the genesis and the purpose of that, being sort of what people may not, have realized. But the concept of leaning into the moment when you even put the helmet on, mm-hmm. In that intro where they pick the helmet up, and they actually put on their heads and then the HUD turns on and that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. That's it's an exciting moment, for the player, and to have it like feel like, oh, see all this digital stuff turn on and it feels Star Warsy, but I've never seen it before. That's a pretty cool moment.
Right.
Yeah. So, I mean, as we wind down, and again, don't want to put you guys on the spot if there's nothing that comes to mind, but I mean, when you've both done so much since Republic Commando and continue to have great careers and doing, a variety of different things. Is there anything from RC specifically that you remember that might have stuck with you that you keep around, that you come back to, but whether it's a learning, a lesson learned or something that was positively influenced your career since then? Again, no pressure. You can decline and say, no, I don't, nothing. I got nothing. I forgot all about this project. But if there's anything, and we can kind of conclude there. And then as Brett usually mentioned, you guys can talk about sort of what you're up to now that you can talk about, or plug anything you're doing, and then we can close up. But maybe back over to you, Paul, on that one.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think this has been touched on before, but we've all been on projects where there's it just gets sort of overly complicated, and not in terms of gameplay mechanics or anything like that. But I'm talking more about just drama and egos and things like that sort of seep into the team and the work. And, my recollection of RC was that, everybody was it was in service of the game. It was just, any idea could come from anywhere, and it was an iterative process and a collaboration. And it just seemed like everybody had the goal of making the best experience possible while, checking egos and checking the drama at the door. And so, I've had, in later years, I've had projects which are not that, and definitely projects that are. And I really just remember fondly RC and just have appreciated more current projects where, people just are in service to the game and service to the project, and the other stuff just sort of falls away. So.
Yeah. Yeah. Well said. Well said.
Yeah. For me, it was great timing for that project and the experience. Like, as you mentioned already, we were going under the radar based on some of the higher profile projects going on within the studio, but we were which meant that we were able to kind of form and solve our own problems. And what I loved about the group is it was all very inclusive. I mentioned already, I was working so closely with Paul Murphy when he was building all of the characters, or working with James Zhang, who you guys worked with on Starfighter. He came in and did some additional concept art for environments, and then even working with the level teams. It was just a very open, collaborative experience.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned Jeremy, and then we have Adam as well, Adam Piper and Jeremy Talbot. I think we briefly mentioned them, I think, in a previous episode, but really some of the most unsung heroes on most teams can often be the tech artists, because they really are putting things together. And I think both of them, and especially Jeremy, who was really could do everything and felt like he was the glue for everything, and just was always driving things. And in some ways, nothing is possible without those guys. And
they had so much energy too. I mean, they're just,
yeah.
I mean, we've already talked about having to add that, the intro part, and just how they just went, I just said, hey, we need a thing. It's this long. I don't care what it is. And then they just went and made it. And, and they gave, they were excited about it. I mean, it's just crazy to me. Especially at the time in our project where that happened, which was pretty late. Like, we were looking at, TCRs and being like, we're not sure how we could possibly get to our load times without doing XYZ. And me figuring out we need something the player can't skip to do that in, and they just did it. They had that kind of energy. So
that's a great point, because now that even when I was art directing on my own projects, I always knew I needed a technical artist sitting next to me. Because they're in that perfect spot where they talk both languages, and they can find how to bridge the two. And especially in cases like some of the tech artists I've been fortunate to work with, such as Jeremy. He's already in the middle of those, building up those ideas. It's pretty critical. Coming out of Harley's interview, that's another. I wanted to come back to technical artists, and how helpful for me in particular they are.
Yeah, right. Well, thank you guys for coming on.
You want to talk a little bit about what you're up to now? Yeah, I mean, we sort of wrapped it into your introductions, but I'd love to hear what you're up to and just kind of plug whatever you've been doing that people can find you at.
Sure. This is Paul.
Yes. Sorry, I should have said, hey, go ahead.
No, so most recently, just a little while back, I did a bunch of work for Mafia 3 with
cool.
Aiden and Hangar 13 at 2K. I did the logo for Mafia 3 and also the graphic design for the print map of the whole world that comes with the game. Which
I have that.
Kind of
neat.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah, it's a beautiful map.
Cool.
Yeah.
And then one of our ex-Lucas guys, Matt Omernick, he's involved with a company called Achille Interactive, which Tim you mentioned at the start. They have the first FDA-approved video game, which they call Digital Medicine, which is used to help kids with ADHD. So I did a bunch of, over the past, it's been 4 or 5 years, working on and off for them doing UI for their game. And then most recently, I did a bunch of work for, there's an app called Top Mix, which is available for the iPhone, which allows easy mixing of music so that you can come up with your own mixes of different songs. That's a pretty cool app. And then most recently, there's an app that's available on Steam called Kovacs Aim Trainer, which allows people to load up environments and weapons from different FPS games. So I got to completely reskin the Kovacs Aim Trainer, which was great working with those guys and just seeing that out there. So that's the most recent stuff.
Cool.
Very cool. How about you, Greg?
Yeah, I started up with EA about 7 years ago when they got the Star Wars license, and with them, I'm working with each art director from each Star Wars team to kind of help them visualize their Star Wars games and tie it back into the whole franchise. We obviously, everything coming out past the Disney purchase is an authentic experience. So trying to design the art of these games so that it's all consistent with it and can be consistent with the films and any other content is pretty challenging while trying to deliver on the art director's individual styles. So it's an awesome opportunity to work with a lot of great teams and fantastic art directors and try to expand the Star Wars universe through the games. We, as Brett mentioned earlier, we did the Battlefront games, also Jedi Fallen Order. We have mobile titles out like Galaxy of Heroes. They've been fun to work on.
Nice.
Super cool. Super cool. Well, thank you both so much. It was really great catching up with you and reminiscing a little bit. It's really fun, and we love so much having the perspectives, especially from people who do jobs different from what Tim and I do, because when you're in it, you don't often really get a sense of that. It's more like, oh, I don't have to deal with this because they're dealing with it, rather than I need to understand what they do, and I really do like understanding what you do. So, and I know our audience does too, so I appreciate it very much.
Oh, thanks. I thought it was a great opportunity to talk to you guys. I thought it's fun to talk about one of my favorite games I've ever worked on.
Wow, great. That's nice. I think we've seen a theme with the interviews, and you guys may not know, but for the podcast, we usually, if we do get an interview on for a series for somebody who's worked on the game, it's usually just one person. So for RC, because we have enough people we know on the project, we've actually had a series of interviews. So it's been fun, and I feel like pretty consistent that people have looked back fondly on the experience. And so I think that shows in the game that fact that everyone had a relatively okay time making it. So
yeah,
good to have you guys on. Thanks so much.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks for having us.
Great talking to you.
Good to talk with all of you again.
Welcome back from the break. I mean, it's always so fun to talk to folks that I've worked with. It's just great. I don't know. I just love it. And these are more people who I just look back and go, man, so good. So good that I get to work with these people.
Yeah.
So
yeah, keeps going.
And they're these in particular are such sweethearts. They're such nice guys.
They're the nicest, most humble, just like people you can tell. I'm sure you can tell from the interview, right? They're just so humble and so literally before we got on, Paul sent me mail and he's sort of like, I just did what people told me to do. I don't really remember if there's much I can share. I was like, no, come on, dude. Like yes, I appreciate you saying that. And that is probably true, but you have insight, and you're a huge portion of why you're the portion of why that thing was successful, the HUD and everything. So just, humble to the end, so they're just two really nice guys, for sure. And it's good to get the art side of it too. And I was just convinced he had implemented stuff. Paul.
Yeah, no, I know. I mean, I think, I mean, one of the things I think, I think he implemented things so that you understood how they function, but he did it inside of whatever art package he was using. And so the sensation was like you would have seen it working, in quote unquote, but just in the, I certainly get that perspective. Like, this is what it's going to look like in motion and things like that. And he did a lot of that so that he had, we said with Harley, that, a demo's worth a million design docs. Like, if he can show you how it's actually going to look and move, you can visualize how it will look and move in game. And you probably made that bridge yourself and made it feel like you had seen it that way.
Paul is very effective at demoing stuff. Yeah. He's excellent. Really good at doing that and, and kind of giving you a hypothetical. And, that was probably early examples of Caveman Tim before Caveman Tim existed, where I was like, oh, Paul's got it in. It's all right. Looks good. Let's move on, So
and he had done that for us on Jedi Starfighter as well. A lot of the, like, how are we going to make the character portraits when they're talking and things like that, look right and sort of hide the fact that they're not, actual talking characters or whatever. I mean, just different sorts of things that he would have had to do for that. So really both very compelling artists, really good at what they do, and covers a wide variety of stuff as well. So terrific to talk to them and get their perspectives and memories on this game. So, and programming came in for a little bit of a ribbing. So that's always fun.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, a little tidbit there. Though we don't, unfortunately we don't. I have no idea who he might be talking about, but
No, I know. I remember. Anyway, I do. Yeah. I didn't at the time. I was like, who did this? And then as we were talking, as normally happens, like memories start to surface as I'm talking. I'm like, oh, that's right. I remember, and I know that that's a rare experience for you. So it's just kind of explaining that for most people, that's a thing that happens. But I know not for you. Another person who came in for some ribbing, though not by name, was Reed Knight. See what I did there?
Segue.
We actually had, this is a rare thing for us, but we had a defense of the choices behind a game by Reed or behind a level in one of the sections we found difficult and talked about. So you want to, and it kind of dovetails nicely with some of the stuff we talked about with Harley last week. So we should have tried to get his permission and done it with that episode, but we didn't have the timeline to do that. But let's go ahead and read Reed's email and then totally tear it down and tell him why it's inadequate.
Yeah, and he wasn't planning on us reading it on air, so we asked him after the fact, and he admitted that he was worried that the mail might come off as defensive. I'm just teasing Reed. No, he was aware of that, and he admitted to it. So
and I should say Reed was on the podcast previously for the TIE Fighter episode, so it's worth just tying that back for folks.
We've had him on before, so otherwise we would have probably just had him on to talk about this, but we had him on once before, so I want to give some other folks opportunity So here's his mail. So Tim informed me that you guys had just done RepCom on the podcast. So I sampled around and at one point found you talking about the hangars and the bridge. One of the lessons I gained from RepCom is that if I'm still having fun playing my own levels when the game ships, they're probably too hard. I think that sentence is good for lots of folks.
Yep. Yeah, we had talked about that with Harley.
Yeah, it's very hard to judge difficulty for your own stuff, but that's a pretty reliable sign. I did have some specific goals in mind, so then he bullets out some stuff. Ramp up towards sheer desperation. The first point, the 3 hangars start with you in control, then divided control, and finally the enemy in control. The ATTE, disguised as ordnance in the VO, is your surprise reward for getting through an intentionally gnarly room. To that end, I intentionally made it harder than the average room to ramp up the contrast between losing control and gaining omnipotence. Omniscience. Omnipotence.
Omnipotence.
That's correct. Yeah, I just second guessed myself. By the way, this kind of, as a quick aside from Tim, this kind of detailed thinking is what I always loved about Reed's level design and design in general. So I think this is a kind of a reason I wanted to read this is I think it's a rare moment when you have somebody who's very academically talking about what they wanted to do with a specific design. So anyway, he continues the next point. The bridge was definitely meant to be a meat grinder. Lacking a boss for Act 2, I wanted to make sure we had a boss level experience of barely hanging on. This was also another attempt to have a sudden contrast, this time between desperate fighting and everything just dropping dead, with obviously the droid control ship going down. But maybe I overdid it. For a little smiley face there, or straight face. I think I did put the back out of the way for that reason, to make it all but useless once the real assault began. He goes on to his next section, encourage experimentation. I realized that with very contained, open, and readable spaces, I could checkpoint the hangar entrance and provide lots of options for the player to try, even if the number of choices was initially kind of baffling. I had a theory at the time that replaying an area isn't nearly as frustrating if you have a lot of different approaches at hand. Something I got from TIE Fighter. Oh, interesting. Forgot about that point. I still stand by that theory, but I may have misjudged the execution somewhat. But I guess I'm admitting that I was anticipating and counting on the difficulty to some degree. One of the reasons I enjoyed testing the hangar is because I could approach differently every time, and as opposed to more cordary. I don't know if I've ever. I guess corridor based levels, but he used corridary, which I guess is a word. Levels of the game, some of mine included, that might be fun but less interesting on replay. The initial Trandoshan hangar is actually one of my favorites in this regard. One thing I learned is that the turrets are scarier than they are dangerous. So I underestimated the player pain here. After hearing you guys, I find myself wanting to play the game now, partly just to see if I'll end up kicking my own ass. I'm gonna use the A word there. I'm sure I've forgotten some of the placement and timing gambits at this point, but I can imagine rediscovering and groaning about some of my own stuff too. Always a mixed bag to go back. So anyway, I thought that was a delightful trip into Reed's brain about that stuff.
And a spirited defense. No, I really like that. I mean, it's one of the things we talked about with Harley, and why I'm kicking myself that we didn't, tie that together better. But just like the knobs that you have to deliver some of that, we just didn't have some of the fidelity that later generations of hardware would have. And so you're kind of stuck with what we had. Right. And like so difficulty and sort of managing difficulty was an important, not, dial to turn to sort of tell the story, the emotional story.
Mm-hmm.
And then similarly with the sort of, and I hadn't even thought about this playing it, but it makes total sense. Like, oh yeah, there's no boss. So it makes total sense to try to make a boss, and that makes a lot of sense in that context, to think of it that way. So yeah, both very interesting. And because you basically kill it like a boss, like he points out, they just die, right? Is also quite good. I mean, it feels like a boss battle from that standpoint. Yeah. I think, the thing I would, if Reed were here, I'd give him a hard time about it. It's like, well, yeah, but people aren't going to play it again and again and again.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's a tough thing. I mean, they will through failure maybe, but
that's, I think unfortunately, I think that's what he meant, right? Is that you're probably going to die. And so you're going to experiment. That's why that section's called encourage experimentation, because you don't really, you wouldn't get to experiment if you weren't dying.
Yeah. If you didn't fail. Yeah.
And that goes back to sort of the macro topic that we bring up time and time again, is just sort of like that difficulty and death in games, and where its place is these days, especially with the Dark Souls of the world, and how experimentation is a part of that, and how do you effectively and safely allow players to fail so they can experiment and not make it feel so punishing, and those games are making a comeback, but they're still not for everybody. And that's not, and RC is not one of those games anyway. So,
right.
But I think the theory, I still appreciate the theory. It's just, it's just how do you have it find its right place in a game that doesn't have that very often? I think that's the other thing, is that the hangar is a fairly unique situation. And so the player's not used to that sort of experimentation, which, again, we learned a lot about and probably would have used more if we had learned that in time.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think maybe even finding a way to extend that build up so you understand when you want to use the different tactics.
Right.
And it's compressed, right? But it's a good idea to try it, and figure it out. So there's, no quibbles with that for sure. I mean, a lot of that stuff was, we're figuring out, like we've said many times, and the next time around we would have understood those things. And of course, tastes have changed to some degree, as the market has gotten larger too. So, and we were all hardcore, PC FPS players as well at the time. And I am so not that anymore, that there's a lot of skills that I just don't have anymore as well. That makes it that much harder for me in particular. So, yeah.
And Reed is a funny example too, because not only did he mention TIE Fighter in his mail, and I forgot about that, but we had him on because he was a tester on TIE Fighter, right? And he and Darren, and so there's also a bit of a notorious sort of, QA become developer when it comes to difficulty, right? QA become a designer, right? Because you become so good at these things that you're working on, and inhumanly becoming so good. So yeah, that was a thing that we had to do. He talks about how if it's the level's still fun for you, when you ship, that's a good indicator that it's too hard. And we had a level like that on Jedi Starfighter that we, really nerfed, in terms of difficulty. But I can remember that being one of my all-time peak game playing experiences when I beat that thing. It was the tug of war, level that John Drake had built. And just like, it was so hard, and I banged my head against it for a long time in development. And when I beat it, it was just amazing. It was just one of those moments. So you totally get it, because you want to have those moments, and you're trying to give that to the player. But yeah, it's easy to lose sight of where your skills are relative to theirs with your game. So. Anyway. Well, thanks, Reed, for letting us read that.
Yep, absolutely. Appreciate it, Reed. And appreciate you as much as I'm giving you a hard time.
I learned a new word. Corridary? Corridary? Is that? You're not reading it with me.
No, I don't have it. I don't have it open, so I don't actually know. I can't actually see it.
Corollary, I guess, is how you'd say that. Anyway, you have the next one?
I do have the next one. I'm trying to find the email now. I'm just going to skip. I'm just going to move on. This one is, the subject is question for Tim. And I apologize to Ryan because in his first sentence, it'll indicate how long it's been sitting in the email, but we're catching up. Question for Tim from Ryan, Biostats. Hey guys, hope Father's Day was enjoyable for both of you. Tim, I wanted to ask what was one or a couple of things you were most proud of from your work on Republic Commando. I had previously asked Brett on his stream, and he gave a very insightful answer, responding with how he was able to reduce siloing and improve communication among the engineering and design teams. Ryan. So there you go. Short and sweet. And I can dive into mine briefly, since all of 6 people probably saw me answer that question. And give yourself some time to think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but one of the things I talked about on the stream when I was asked was just that, although we talked a lot today with the artists, with Paul and Greg, about how there wasn't a lot of ego, there was a point in time when I joined the project where there was some friction between, especially design and engineering, and there was a sense, I don't know, it's hard to explain really what it was at the time, but there was definitely some feeling like they were working so hard to work well with each other, but there was something was building up. Some, I don't know, resentment's too strong, but just like there was a certain amount of like, you don't appreciate me, type, and how much I'm doing and how much I still have to do. And just like that feeling of overwhelm and, and then being, and not to speak too much for the designers, but on the design side, not maybe having enough visibility into that, like, just what it takes to do some of the things that they needed, and like, or even just, I don't know. I mean, there's things like prioritizing what you would do for people, and giving, one of the things that I reintroduced on that project was back on the Starfighter projects I had given in the bug database, the development bug database, not the QA one. I had given all the designers, I said, you can mark any one of your bugs as your number one bug. Like, if you could fix one thing for me, this would be it. Like a feature request or whatever. And, and I would just, and you always had one, and it's like, you can just make whatever thing it is. And then I think I gave a couple key artists, Pat Cirque and somebody else, like one as well, to sort of represent those groups as well. And it really gave me visibility into what their pain points were that I didn't know. Like, and sometimes they were really easy to fix. Like, and it's like, totally. It'll take me 10 minutes, and it'll be in tomorrow's build, and, and it'll make your life so much better. And I had no idea. Like, we talked about that a little bit in terms of like, being able to visualize something is so much more important, than that I have more features. Just being able to see stuff would help a lot. So it's stuff like that as well, of just, helping them communicate better so that they both had an appreciation of each other's needs, each other's capabilities. There's a lot of that. Just like, we're both really working hard, and to kind of help see that we're all working in the same direction. So that was one of the things that I really, I had lots of little features and things that I thought up or suggested or helped direct. And those are all great too. And that's something that players really see. But for my own personal growth as a leader, I think that was a real challenge and an important thing to overcome. So, all right, back to you then. Now that I've blown some air around.
I think I would have 2 responses. One that's sort of like yours, and then it's team centric, and then one maybe product centric. The team one, which I can't and wouldn't take complete credit for, but as the creative director for the project, and Greg and Paul just talked about it, the fact that the team generally felt like ideas could come from anywhere, and that it was a collaborative, iterative process, but that we still were able to ship a game. And what I mean by that is the the team felt like there was that healthy collaboration was there, but there was still enough direction to actually have it be unified and come to fruition in a, generally good way. The output, because you collaboration's good, but you don't want design by committee, and you don't want everyone to kind of be going in their own direction. So you still need some guidance there, and that's coming from all the leads, really, not just me, but on the creative side, it was me and Chris and such. But the fact that the team felt that way and we still were able to pull it off, I guess I would be proud of that, because, I've done this job a few times, and, that definitely depends on a lot of different variables on how successful you can be with that. And, in certain teams, you can't be that collaborative because it just doesn't work that way, and you need to be more directive and things like that. But then for whatever reason, we found a good recipe on this one. And the fact that unprompted from us, I feel like every interview we've done so far, people have mentioned something like that. I'm definitely proud that, that I was able to be a director in that sense, and still people felt good about, being involved with the creative process. So that's one. The other one, product wise, and this is really the Star Wars nerd coming out, is, and probably fairly personal, but I feel like maybe it did resonate with the audience, because it, people still do, speak positively about the game today. I'm really proud of the whole thing that we've talked about over the series, of just the perspective of Star Wars that we were able to deliver to the Star Wars audience. And what I mean by that, as a Star Wars fan, having a game without Jedi, having a game about the troopers, having a game, or just an experience even, in the trenches, was something that I always wanted, as a fan, and felt like we just never got. It was always just the melodrama. And I think Star Wars is a lot about melodrama, because that's really, it's part of its pillars and its bread and butter, but it's so much more. It can be so many more things. And I think it was great that Greg brought up Rogue One as one example, and he brought up the Ralph McQuarrie story, and then he ended it with, or did he say that off air? He said it off air.
That might have been off air. Yeah,
where some of Ralph McQuarrie's influences were his, from his military background. And, you see some of those iconic shots of his in on the Hoth shots, the very famous trench Hoth shots that he did of the rebel troopers in the trenches. And you kind of can see some of the mentality behind that. And you see a little bit of that scene, that Hoth, the specific scene is shot fairly well. But it's still about the heroes mainly, right? It's about Luke and Han and everybody. You don't really get too many good shots about the plight of the soldier in that. And, it's called Star Wars, it's not called Star Jedi or Star, superhero or whatever.
It's not called Jedi Power Battles.
Sometimes it is. And sometimes it's called, and there definitely are good reasons to have games about Jedi. I'm not saying that you want those too, but I'm just proud that we were able to deliver a different kind of perspective on something that, to be honest, I love. So that's my selfish one.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. It definitely, it grows the universe in an interesting way. And that's, a lot of the, we talked with Darren about, Dark Forces, and Dark Forces really seeks to tell a Star Wars story, but still around sort of character drama, a direct character story and an arc, and how that intersects with the films and all that stuff. And, and he even becomes a Jedi in the next one. So it's, they can't stay away from that.
It's inescapable. Yeah. And I was always bummed about that too.
Yeah. It's it's a lot. It's what a lot of the audience does want, especially, not to pigeonhole, but generally speaking, I would say the younger part of the audience, right, is wants to be that hero, right? And I totally get that. But
the strata of the Star Wars audience is, especially these days, right, because it's such an old franchise. It's multifaceted, so I think that's a good thing, and that's why I think something like RC can work, right? Is that you're not going for everybody,
right?
You're going first, and that doesn't necessarily always make the best business model, I guess someone might say. But there are a lot of different ages, right? And I think it's good to have those different. And again, Rogue One is a good example because there's people who didn't like Rogue One. There's Star Wars fans that didn't like it, and there are those that did. And it's just a different approach. But it's actually become one of my favorites. So for maybe obvious reasons. And I don't know if you know this, but I was going to mention it on the cast, but Gary Whitta was one of the co-writers. It was, I think, his original concept. He wrote the original story for it, but other writers came in to finish it off. But Gary Whitta, he's a game guy. He's a game journalist,
right? Yeah,
turned film scriptwriter, screenwriter. He did a Book of Eli as well, but so he's coming from
that Fallout movie.
Yeah, right. Yeah, basically. So he's so he was kind of, I'm sure he's of our ilk, is what I mean. So you can you can see a Rogue One idea coming from someone like that.
I mean, in theory.
Yeah.
Maybe someday.
Someday.
All right, why don't we take this last email from Nick from LA?
Okay, AI squad effectiveness from Nick from Los Angeles. Hi, Brett and Tim. Thanks. Thank you for this fascinating breakdown of Republic Commando. One question I had was around the effectiveness of your AI squad mates. Was there a concern they were too effective in combat? While I didn't try it myself, I assumed that, aside from the levels where you are by yourself, you could complete the game only using commands and not firing your weapon. Granted, this would be quite a challenge. It seems like other games with AI squad mates tend to shy away from AI being able to eliminate enemies or turn the tide of battle. I'm curious if during development, was there ever a concern of a player not feeling like they are the hero because their squad mates did too much? On one specific example from other games is the role of AI-friendly Spartans in Halo Reach versus Halo 5. In Reach, the Spartans rarely eliminate enemies and tended to stay back to let the player take charge. While in Halo 5, they were fully capable of clearing the battlefield. In parenthetical, guessing Tim had a hand in this change. Thank you both again for your insightful podcast. Nick from Los Angeles.
If that is your real name, long last name there.
Yeah.
I think that was a bit of an argument, as so many things were.
Oh yeah.
Because it really was kind of breaking that mold. It also is a challenge, I will say, and again, kudos to John Hancock for delivering on it. But to make effective, player or friendly AI that can sort of keep pace with the player without really cheating all that much, right? I mean, they don't run out of ammo, I guess, But so there are some sort of mild cheats. That's also a design thing. Like you don't want them picking up your ammo. But I think you probably could play the game, with just them, with them as your weapon. In fact, that was the tagline. Remember that?
Yep. I was just going to say that.
The squad is your weapon. That was the whole thing that we were saying at E3 that year.
Yeah, that was our marketing tagline. In fact, it's on the copy and everything.
Yep.
And I was going to jokingly reference it as well because, and he, I think very appropriately brings up Halo 5. Because obviously I worked on both of those, so I can speak about them pretty in-depthly. But the interesting thing, so yeah, the squad is your weapon. And the reason I was going to bring it up is it kind of nails it on the head. I don't remember exactly where that came from, who thought it up, but it hits the nail on the head from a goals perspective, and it definitely was a debate because Star Wars, like we just finished talking about, Star Wars was a hero-based franchise, right? You are often the hero, Dark Forces, Jedi Knight, those previous shooters were very focused on that. And we I don't think fully knew it at the time, but we hadn't fully digested it. But over the course of the project, we definitely found that, the focus of this was the team. It wasn't as much, you were the boss, because you were leading this the squad, but it didn't mean you had to do everything. In fact, as we talked about, sort of giving the characters more identity, that, another reason that was coming up is because it felt like they didn't have enough. And so, but they, from a gameplay perspective, they had things to do. And so I think what I'm long-winded way of saying the goals were different. And what I mean by that is, talking about Halo versus Republic Commando. And this was about the team effort. And so the debate was coming from, what kind of game are you making? Well, once we've convinced people that this was about the squad in its entirety, then I think probably people calm down. But once you make that your goal, then it is okay to have them be effective and to, allow them to play the game for you, because it's just what the goal is, and everything's built around it. The levels are built around it. The AI is built around it. The maneuvers, right? All those different things. An interesting thing about Halo 5 specifically, I can't speak to Halo Reach because I didn't work on that, but having played it, like the Halo is about, Spartans are heroes. Spartans are superheroes. They are not what these commandos are. These commandos are elite, but they are still, kind of grunts. And I think one challenge we had on Halo 5 was that threading the needle on that, right? Because you wanted each of them to feel like Spartans, so they had to be effective, but you also didn't want your main character to, feel like they were not the hero. And so that, combined with Halo, has completely different level and enemy or encounter design. And so one of the challenges with Halo 5 was, I would say, the squad, which a lot of people don't know this, but a lot of the squad stuff was going on in pre-pro before I even joined the project. So the team actually already wanted to do some of that stuff. And I kind of added my spin on it once I got on the project in pre-pro because of Republic Commando. But I would say that the squad mechanics in that were a little more sort of layered on top of a Halo game, versus in RC, it was the point, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And so in Halo 5, we kind of made them more effective because the level design is so open, and we wanted it to feel that way. But also that game had a very heavy co-op focus. So, all of the squad were going to be there all the time. So yeah, very different goals and different designs. And I think, though we didn't fully know it during production, I think the good thing about RC is that it was all kind of developed together and designed together to work together versus, separate. So.
Right. Yeah, no, it's a good point. I mean, I think that, this actually ties in a little bit to, I'll go and toot your horn a little bit as far as the prior question and what you're proud of. I think that, one of the things that you've always been really, really strong at least, in the games I worked on with you, is building consensus. And, I think that this was a big hill to climb, in the Star Wars universe. And so that it required a lot of building consensus and really constantly getting those messages across, of what the pillars were for the game and why, and what it should feel like and what the goals should be and how levels should play on that. I mean, all of that stuff all tied together, but you were driving it, and that was, like you said, was sort of your vision and had to be carried, and yet at the same time integrate all these different perspectives and bring the best out of them, and figure out how to tie it all together. I mean, one of the things that I picked up from this time in the industry for myself was, when somebody comes to you with a good idea, you have to find a way to say yes on a project. You have to find a way. It might be yes, but sometimes it's yes, and hopefully it's that. You want to find ways to, because somebody's, invested their passion and interest in coming up with ideas for you and bringing them to you, and you want to nurture that. And, and if it can't be done, you want to gently explain, why and how it doesn't correspond with a pillar, or that the investment is or simply too high, or I don't know. It depends on the reasons. But there's a lot of that, of just trying to take those ideas in and find ways to make them work within the overall vision, and like maybe respin them to make them work. So in this case, right, I think that the hard job for you was building consensus around they are effective in combat. Like that's part of the core fantasy, is that you're one of four. That's a big ask, in a Star Wars game, as you rightly pointed out. So I think that's another thing to sort of be proud of, and one of your skills that you really developed, over the course of the time I worked with you there. So.
No, thanks. I appreciate that. I don't know. I mean, I would like to agree. I don't know if I always want to do better at that, but it's good to hear that. Well,
I mean, it's a hard thing to do.
Yeah,
I'm not going to, that is one of the hardest things to do. Right. And especially in games. Right. And, also it's kind of, especially in design, like, because when it comes to everybody can design, right, is the theory, right? It's not true, but everybody thinks they are, and it's not really true. I mean, I just over the last, couple of episodes, this one where we're hearing Reed's perspective, and last time talking so much with Harley, like the actual work that goes into it is very different, than what people think of, right? There's a lot of there's the idea, and then it sort of happens, right? Is what a lot of people, thinking about, about what design is, and it's a lot more complicated than that. And it involves building consensus, communicating with others, and finding ways to incorporate all of these things, all these ingredients you have, and make something that works. So,
another funny small example that I always remember thinking back, where people were not flabbergasted, but like in disbelief that it was a thing that we were going to do, that I think ended up sort of helping prove the point, was the fact that you didn't die until all of your squad members died.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you remember those debates, but it's sort of like,
oh, I do.
Wait, you're going to go down and just lay there and wait?
Oh yeah. I was totally behind doing that. I was like, oh, we have to try it. We have to make that happen. Yeah. I was all in on that when that idea came up. I totally was like, oh, we have to make that work.
Yeah.
Because I've never seen that. Like,
well, yeah. And it's not only that your squad is your weapon, but the squad is your health,
Yeah.
And that was another concept that again was breaking people's brains as far as shooters go, right? Because you always that lone hero, and you go down, and that's very clear.
That's it. You reload. Yeah.
So, but again, once we were able to get that working, I think it started to chip away, and people understood. It was another sort of check in that side of the, for the sense of the squad and the team that I'm proud of. So.
Yep. Absolutely. Well, thank you for those questions, Nick and Ryan,
good ones.
for Reed's feedback. Appreciate those very much. Those were sent, of course, to devgameclub@gmail.com. Not Reed's, because he has our personal email, but you know what I'm saying. Anyway, so we are hoping to have yet another interview, more design focused next time. We are still scheduling that, so we will see. But I think that will happen. So it's just a question of getting it on the calendar. So one more, I believe. And I just want to throw out there, of course, you can find us on the web at devgameclub.com, or on Twitter at devgameclub, or you can also find my co-host at
Tim Longo Jr. with the JR at the end.
Last week, I was talking about how on twitch.tv/Brett Douville, I was getting close to the end of Kirby's Epic Yarn and Epic Mickey. And in fact, before the episode even aired, I had finished both, and have moved on now to Super Mario RPG Legend of the Seven Stars. So you can come by and check that out. That game is delightful, and I quite like it. So come have a laugh with me, because I find myself delighted many times. Anyway, our intro and outro music was written and performed by Kirk Hamilton and commissioned by friend of the cast, Aaron Evers. Thanks so much for tromping down the hallways of the prosecutor with us this week, and good night.
Good night.
I'm running out of things to say at the end, too.